So up until now, we have always been talking about low-pass filters and what they do. And you can imagine them to be kind of like a black box. Numbers coming in, numbers going out, and it's just that these numbers that come out somehow don't like changing. And that's one way to imagining low-pass filters. But at some point, you're going to have to think about high-pass filters and what it actually is. So a low-pass filter essentially extracts the low-frequency content, the slow changes within the signal, and let them pass. But what we're looking for in a high-pass filter is exactly the opposite. Essentially, it is exactly the information that we have just filtered out. So how do we retrieve this information? And the answer is actually quite simple. We are taking the incoming signal, remember that's the one that makes this step, and we're sending it here to that block, and we're subtracting something. So we are subtracting exactly what we have just filtered. So we're taking the original signal, sending it through a low-pass filter. We don't actually need this information. We just need to subtract it from the original signal. So what comes out of this high-pass filter is actually exactly the information that we have just filtered out up here, because that's what we do not subtract from the original signal. So think of this entire thing here as a high-pass filter. There's stuff coming in on one side, there's stuff going out on the other side. And within that high-pass filter, there is, yes, of course, there is a low-pass filter, but we only need that low-pass filter to create the signal that we subtract from the original so that the high-frequency content is left over. And so let's implement this in a graph in Excel here. What we have here is the simplest possible low-pass filter. Time is in this column, the input signal is in this, it makes the step, and then the output is a low-pass filter. Sorry, this one is the output is a low-pass filter. So we're going to create a high-pass filter. We're calling it HP1. It's going to be an output, and we're simply creating that output by going equal, and then it equals the input signal minus the low-pass filtered signal that we have just created. Now double click here to propagate the data down here, and let's take a look at that data in a graph. We can just go right click, select data. I think you've done this before. You add a series, the name is this one, and then so on. And what we're left with is this yellow graph. That is the output of the high-pass filter, and as you can see, they are complementary. Do you see the surface area below the blue dots, from the blue dots to the green graph to our low-pass filter? Well, the yellow graph is exactly the inversion of that. It's the complement to the green low-pass filter, and of course it's the complement, we just created it by subtracting the values in this column. So be aware, while the green low-pass filtered signal just gradually goes up to that value and only adopts the blue value over the longer time, the yellow is exactly the opposite. It adopts that new value pretty much in an instant. But if there's no more change, it kind of gets tired and falls back to sleep and goes back to zero. So the yellow graph, high-pass filtered signal, will always essentially have a tendency to wanna be zero unless something is happening, in which case that change is being adopted very quickly. But if nothing changes anymore, it'll die down to zero. Opposite on the low-pass filter, it will only go through the effort of climbing up here if that value stays up there. If it jumps around and jumps up and down, the green has a certain inertia to it. Think of it like this. Now you might remember this from the third video. It's a random walk. It's a bit of a jittery line. There's some random and there's some sine wave into this signal, and we use the low-pass filter to generate this smoothed out green line. So if I subtract the green line from the blue one, I got this red line. And as you can see, the red line is exactly the difference between the blue and the green one. If the blue is above the green one, then we're in the positive. If the blue is below the green one, then we're in the negative. And what you can probably see is the red line, the high-pass signal, it doesn't care whether that blue line is below the zero line or above the zero line. It actually only cares of whether it is changing. So you can see every peak is present, every valley is present. This ridge here is up there, and even the shape of the peaks are contained here. You see that double peak? It's still that double peak. It's just that we don't really care whether it's below or above the horizon. We just care whether it's pointy and whether it's going up or it's going down. That is the property of a high-pass filter. It only takes into account the small changes, and it pretty much ignores all the signal that is continuously present, all the values that don't change. So to put another image in your head, imagine this was a road surface. Then the low-pass filter, the green one, that's kind of, if someone asked you, well, how high, what was the elevation of the road, you would take that low-pass filtered signal, because there's no point in measuring the elevation of a road for a map, for example, down to the last millimeter. But if someone asked you, well, what was the graininess? How did it feel? What was the asphalt, the surface texture? What was that like? Then the red curve, the high-pass filter, would answer you that question. So be aware that this entire thing is a high-pass filter. It internally contains a low-pass filter that you need to generate the signal to subtract from the original signal, and that when either in Uber or in my own software in Jamie, if you punch in a number, a filter variable for a high-pass filter, what you are actually doing is you're changing the filter variable for that low-pass filter. So whenever you kind of imagine what you're doing, by changing that number, you're influencing the signal that is being subtracted, that is taken out of the original signal. That's what you're doing. And there's something else I would like to point out to you. I just said the high-pass filter maintains all these peaks and valleys. Well, it has a little bit of different side effect to it that is quite interesting. Look at this. For example, when the original signal has an uphill slope, means it has a positive gradient, it changes towards the positive. In that moment, the high-pass filtered signal will end up on the positive side. And then on the other side, where it has a downward slope, a negative gradient, the output signal will end up on the negative side. So while it is not a perfect derivative, you can at least, I hope you can at least see that the high-pass filtered signal kind of depicts whether or not the signal is climbing or descending. It's not a perfect derivative, but for the purposes we're using it, I think it should give you an idea of why a high-pass filter can be used kind of like a derivative. Not perfectly, but for our purpose, it really does the job. You see this long downhill slope here, which means that the signal goes down and reduces in values. Well, that's exactly the area where our high-pass filtered signal is continuously below zero, because that's a negative gradient. And here is a longer uphill gradient, and that is exactly the area where our high-pass filtered signal is continuously in the positive. So in a way, the high-pass filtered signal reflects whether or not that signal is climbing or descending. And I'm going to probably make another video only about that question, but what you should at least get a taste of is we're using high and low pass filters, but what we behind closed doors kind of as a side effect are gratefully accepting is the fact that it is a behavior that is very, very similar to an integration or to a derivative. You can do really, really funny things with it, and as soon as you make yourself aware that this is one of the ways in which high and low pass filters behave.